Hey everybody, Joey the Recovery Guy here. I had a comment on one of my videos I did a while ago about what is spiritual malady. The video was titled, "What is Spiritual Malady?" And someone commented something like, "Hey, what happened to the rest of the video?" So I haven't actually watched that video, so I went and watched the end of it, and it just cuts off. I apologize about that. I have no idea how or when that happened. I do believe I've edited that video, although it could have been somebody else. But anyways, I thought I would do like a little bit of a recap slash even extension of that video. Now, it was a long time ago, and I'm not really sure what I was going to say next, but you know, there's some things that I missed in that video that we should just go over anyways. And again, I might repeat myself a little bit because I do kind of forget what I talked about in that video. The spiritual malady, it's my most viewed video. It's a really interesting topic because, you know, as far as like a 12-step recovery program goes, it's like they say it's the origin of the illness. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a spiritual malady, and I guess that's where our selfishness and self-centeredness comes from. And you know, all forms of all different types of our symptoms ultimately relate back to this thing they call spiritual malady. And I mean, there's a big problem with that because, you know, I don't even think as a species, humans even know what spirituality even means. Like, there's no actual really clear-cut definition of the word. Like, you know, generally it's associated with like doing the right thing, not being a dick, not being judgmental, being kind to people, and you know, having goodwill towards all things. And you know, and then there's like, you know, the yoga people, and it's like almost like, you know, your ability to understand what's going on inside of your body is also considered spiritual. There's also, you know, the theory that it's part of who you are. Like, you've got your body, you've got your mind, and you've got your spirit, and the spirit is kind of like the wild card. It's kind of like, it's almost like that's where we get our free will from. It's like kind of like the overarching like thing, I guess, that is in control of all the other elements of our body, whether that be our immune system, our psychology, our biology, our personality. It's kind of like the thing that brings unity to all the various parts of our body. And it's all very interesting stuff, and like I really like the subject of spirituality myself, but again, it doesn't really actually mean anything when you think about it. Like, my best guess is, and it's a really, really bad guess, and there's not a whole lot of evidence or like huge amounts of thought that is required, is what we call spirit is an emergent phenomenon. We have our biology, we have our brains, we have our nervous system, and we have our I guess our ego, or our conditioned mind, and those two kind of things form together, and then those two things interact with a very complex environment, and as our spirit, you know, kind of emerges from that. It's like kind of like our flavor, if you will. And I know that doesn't do it justice, but I don't know if anyone has a more accurate description than that, to be honest. So when I talk about spiritual malady, I like to come at it from a bunch of different perspectives. You guys would have seen, if you watched my last video, that I have you could conceptualize spiritual malady as a resistance to presence, and that's more of kind of, I guess, a Buddhist philosophy or a Buddhist interpretation of what a spiritual malady could be. I have a conception being a threat sensitivity, so like essentially we're sensitive to threat, whether that be because of our psychology or because of our biology. Like, it could be an amygdala issue or it could be a belief system issue. Irregardlessly, we have a problem with threat sensitivity, and we just overreact to everything, and little things seem like big things, and you know, and that might not be a huge deal like each and every day, but you add that over the span of a lifetime, and all the little things in your life seem like insurmountable obstacles. Of course, we're going to end up using drugs and relapsing and stuff like that. I have a more biological, I guess, idea of what spiritual malady could be, and and I like to usually I like to title it "Slave to Your Biology." Now, for this, I guess it'll do us just fine to talk about the fear response in general. The fear response is kind of a three-part system, okay? And it's communication ultimately between your amygdala, your hippocampus, and your prefrontal cortex. Now, some of your prefrontal cortex is just that. It's considered your neo-mammalian or your human part of you, but you know, anatomists also classify some parts of your prefrontal cortex as a limbic structure. And limbic structures is, I guess you could say, it's your emotional brain. And your hippocampus is in the limbic system, or is classified as part of the limbic system, and so is the amygdala. So, your amygdala is central to fear and aggression. It's your little emotional epicenter, if you will. So I think of it as it's kind of like a radar. It's always like pulsing out. It's always looking for stuff. Your amygdala is always on the prowl for things that are maybe what you could say anomalous. So, like if you hear a really loud noise all of a sudden, or like someone starts screaming, something that's not normal, not mundane, it's not in your usual predictive model and what you think is going to happen, that your amygdala goes after that and it goes, what is that? And it asks you a question, essentially. It goes, is that scary? That's the question that your amygdala asks. And should I be mad? Like, should I generate anger in order to kill this threat, if there is in fact a threat? And then your hippocampus. Now, your hippocampus is involved in memory. It's not so much your stored memory, it's more like working memory. It's more like the person that is in charge of the filing of your memory. There was famously this case where this guy was having seizures, and they gave him medication, he kept having seizures. They gave him different medication, they kept having seizures. They punched him in the head until he couldn't think anymore, kept having seizures. Just joking about that last part. But essentially what they happened is they hooked him up to like an EEG. They're just trying to figure out where's the epicenter of these seizures, and they found out it was in his hippocampus. So they're like, okay, well, I guess we'll take it out. I believe this was in the 30s or the 20s or something like that. Anyways, these doctors removed his hippocampus successfully. He was alive. And what happened is that he didn't actually lose his memories. He still remembered everything. He just lost the ability to learn new memories. So it was like Adam Sandler 51st Date style. So the hippocampus is involved in processing memories and putting them where they should go. Is this a fearful memory? Is this a kind memory? And it's also, associated with recall. Now, when it comes to the fear response, the amygdala notices the anomalous stimuli, if you will. The hippocampus now will provide you with the relevant memories. And if you have memories of being hurt or really, really scared in association with whatever environmental stimulus is going on, the hippocampus is going to go like, I agree with you, I think that should be fear. But that is not necessarily when the fear response comes into play. The prefrontal cortex also needs to be involved in the process, and it kind of provides context. Well, yes, that was a loud noise. Okay, the amygdala, yeah, that was a loud noise. It's not normal. Your hippocampus, yeah, last time you heard that noise, you got shot in your ass or whatever. But then the prefrontal cortex will be like, we're in a firing range. Context. So in the context of being at a gun range, hearing the sound of a gunshot is not scary. And ultimately, your prefrontal cortex can shut down the fear response. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. If it's not always able to do that, if the noise is too loud, too scary, too quick, your cortex doesn't get to get involved. So if it's, if you're not at a gun range and you're just at a school and, it's at a time where you're living in the States and there's been lots of school shootings recently, which always seems to be happening down there for whatever reason, and you hear that noise, your prefrontal cortex is not likely to get involved. It's going to be an immediate emotional response that shuts down the cortex, and then you're in a full-blown fear response. Now, some people are more susceptible to having their cortex shut down with anomalous stimuli or things that maybe are scary to your brain. And those are people with trauma. So here's another couple things that are going on, is that your amygdala actually gets bigger if you have lots of childhood trauma or just in response to trauma in general. And how they figured this out is they were actually doing brain studies on people with PTSD, and they found that their amygdalas were enlarged. And the actual part of your amygdala that gets enlarged is the soma, or the cell body of a neuron. So your brain communicates via neuronal projections. It sends little electrical impulses firing down these neuronal highways. The cell body of the neuron is the part of the neuron that receives these projections. It receives information. So the part of your amygdala that gets bigger is the part that's receiving information, which would lead you logically to conclude, and maybe we'll discover this is wrong later on, but you have more, it's hypersensitive. It's going ding, 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 and it's noticing every little thing as a potential fear response. Now, another thing with trauma and what can happen is the hippocampus will atrophy. So the hippocampus will actually get smaller. And our bodies and our brains are survival machines, and they're game theory survival machines. So they're constantly making calculations on probabilities. If the amygdala is hypersensitive and it goes, is that scary? Holy whatever. Your hippocampus, if it's not efficient enough to accurately process that information, it's going to initiate the fear response. Because in the lack of information, with the lack of information, it's better to be safe than sorry. So triggering a fear response and having, nothing actually happen, maybe you'll release a little bit of cortisol, maybe you'll stress yourself out, maybe you'll expend some extra calories running around like for no apparent reason. Not very consequential. But when we're talking about if there is something scary and you choose not to get scared about it, you could die. So game theoretically, it's far more safe to trigger that fear response anyway. So that's as a result of an atrophied hippocampus. So when we're talking about spiritual malady and we're talking about threat sensitivity, what we really need to be, if you have a more biological lens in which you view life, if you're more scientific or determinist in nature, or you happen to be into neuroscience, not like anyone's actually really into that kind of stuff, then you want to look at it this way. And the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala are going to be central in your fear response. Now, if you do have an enlarged hippocampus, you do have a enlarged amygdala, and an atrophied hippocampus, and your prefrontal cortex is very prone to being shut off due to heightened emotional states, or the fact that we've just suscepted ourselves to a bunch of brain damage by using drugs, then we're going to constantly be scared of everything, and we're going to constantly have a steady flow of cortisol in our bodies, and everything's going to scare us, and eventually, over a period of time, we're just going to wonder why life sucks so much. We're going to be feeling depressed all the time. It's going to shut down our immune system. It's going to limit non-essential functions, so our digestion's not working so good. We don't have as much energy, and of course we're going to want to use drugs and alcohol about that. Well, maybe not, of course, but definitely our peoples, we will always resort back to drugs and alcohol when the going gets tough, if you will. Now, I guess really what I wanted to talk about is, like, I in my last video, I think I discussed the belief systems or a model of reality being wrong. So that's more of a psychological interpretation. I just described more of a biological interpretation. In my old video, Resistance to Presence, that's kind of a Buddhist interpretation. But let's not leave out the godfather of all the sciences, which is physics. Physics is basically the most fundamental science. It gives rise to all the other science. Well, you could say maybe math. So here's kind of the hierarchy when it comes to science. Math, physics, chemistry, biology, social science. That's the kind of hierarchy. So we're going all the way down to the level of physics. Now, I'm not nearly knowledgeable enough to describe spiritual malady as a mathematical problem, but I can, generate a physics interpretation of spiritual malady. So when we want to talk about that, I want to talk to you guys about the word entropy. Now, entropy is an extremely interesting word. Lots of people kind of have heard it before. It's almost the measure of disorder. It's the amount of disorder. The second law of thermodynamics essentially states that entropy must always increase in a closed system. So when a system is not receiving energy from the outside, it tends to degenerate. And you guys know this. If you guys leave your car in the backyard for 50 years getting weathered, it's going to start to rust out. If you leave your cup of coffee on the counter, it's going to get colder. Now, the more entropy, the more disorder, or the more simple it is. The lower the entropy, the higher ordered this item is, and the more complexity. If I just have a cup of coffee, which I don't have right now, let's just use this candle holder as an example. Let's just say I have a nice warm cup of coffee in here. This cup of coffee in relation to the rest of the room, except for maybe me and I guess the lights, would be considered more complicated than the rest of the room, because the room is room temperature. The books over here, these books, my computer's been off for a while, everything's the same temperature, right? Thermoequilibrium. But there's this one little pocket of air or space that happens to be extremely, extremely hot, and the particles contained in this tiny little unit are moving far, far, far faster than the particles on the outside. Now, that's ordered, okay? A lot of work had to go in to make this little pocket of space way hotter, and it involves microwaves and maybe old Back in the day, it would have been like a campfire or a coffee mate. It doesn't really matter why it's hot. The fact is that it's hot and the rest of the things are not. Now, if this is not receiving energy from anywhere else, this cup of coffee, it is essentially what they call a closed system. It's not receiving energy from the outside. So what will happen, it will always return to its simplest arrangement of particles. It will always return to thermal equilibrium. It'll return to room temperature and everything will be fine. Now, obviously, if you had a hot plate or a microwave and you used the microwave or the hot plate, you could keep that cup of coffee hot and it would remain more complex in its chemical structure, being the particles are moving really fast, than the rest of the room. But that would be an open system. That means it's... So anywho, here's what happens. We have the Earth very, 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 very long time ago. What happens is that essentially there's waters and there's a bunch of particles floating around in this water, and essentially what happens is we got the sun. Now, our Earth, our biosphere, is not a closed system because it receives energy ultimately from the sun. And why we exist is because of the sun, and why all life exists is because of the sun. So the sun heats up this primordial soup, they call it, and particles start moving around because of the heat, and they start latching on together. Eventually enough particles latch onto each other and it forms an amino acid. Eventually enough amino acids form together that they make a protein. Eventually enough proteins latch together that they, boom, biogenesis happens. Now, obviously this is a gross simplification. I could be wrong about a lot of things because I'm not super familiar with biogenesis and the exact chemistry that needed to be involved in order to make life from non-life happen. It's actually a very complicated issue. We've been able to recreate it with perfect conditions in the lab, but there's no way that we can actually say for certain that those conditions were around at the time biogenesis happened. So it's still a contested topic in science. Anywho, single-celled organisms happen. Now the sun's still up there, it's still throwing energy down, and I'm going somewhere with this as it relates to alcoholism and spiritual malady. This isn't a lesson on entropy per se, but you guys do need to know something about it in order for this video to make any sense to you guys. So keeps raining down energy. Eventually those single-celled organisms, because they have such an abundance of energy and now there's little foods popping up for them, they can turn into multi-celled organisms. And then eventually these turn into like, you know, little tiny microscopic insect-like things. And then eventually there's plant life and the insects can feed off the plant life, and then the bigger insects can feed off those insects. And then you can get more complicated plant life like Venus flytrap, stuff that eats those bugs, and then you start getting amphibians and reptiles, and then you start getting birds, and then you start getting mammals. And then because this constant flow of energy from the sun, and we're not a closed system, the level of complexity is allowed to just build. And you guys know, like, a dog is a lot more complicated than, let's just say, a single-celled organism. Although there are very smart single-celled bacteria and viruses out there, you know, a dog is a highly ordered structure. Now, mammals are at the top. As far as animals go, mammals are more complex than all of the other life that goes before it. And of mammals, there is the apes, or primates. And of the primates, the most complicated of them are the great apes. And of the great apes, the most complicated great ape is a human. We are technically a great ape species. And we are, humans especially, occupy the highest level on this chain of complexity. We are the lowest entropy, meaning we are the most complex and the highest ordered structure actually that we know about. We are more, the only comparable relation we have in terms of complexity is that human brains are as complicated as allegedly as the singularity that existed at the Big Bang. We are far more complicated than any computer, than any car, than any society. If you look at the world as one organism and see how, you know, the planetary systems affects our tide and fires, burning forests to fertilize other, like, not even close to as complex as a single human brain. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. You're looking at me right now and you're thinking, that guy is clearly not the most complex thing in the known universe. And I don't think that when I'm talking to you guys, but we are actually the lowest entropy structure that we know about. So here's the thing, is that defying entropy, which is what some physicists think that life is the eternal struggle against entropy. We constantly need to feed this machine. Like physically, we got a lot going on, and we need to stay on top of things to maintain our complexity, or else we degenerate, right? So physically, humans are not a closed system because we're able to eat. So I get an orange. The orange is a highly complicated structure. It's got the peel that protects it. It's got the individual slices within it. It's got seeds which contain the potential for an entirely new tree. Like oranges are insanely ordered. And what humans do, and I know this is going to get a bit weird for you guys, but we eat that orange. And we eat meat, we eat oranges, we eat all types of fruit and vegetables, and what happens is we shit them out. Now, all the food that we eat, there's so much variance. Humans eat more kinds of food than any other animal by a million times, but we all poo out the same thing. Poo. And what happens is we are stealing the complexity contained in the food, and we are shitting out the simplicity. And I know you guys are thinking, like, what on earth are you talking about? This is exactly what is happening. We are stealing complexity of items, and because we are always receiving that outside energy, we can maintain our position. Now, you guys know what happens if we stop eating. That means we've turned ourselves into a closed system. Entropy will take over and we'll start to degenerate. You don't let someone eat for a week, 2 weeks, they just die. You severely limit people's diet. What happens is they become less healthy. You don't get enough B vitamins. You're not thinking clearly. You don't get enough vitamin C. You get scurvy, and then you get all these crazy new diets that are coming out, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, because it's we can't just eat grass like a grazing animal, because we have a lower level of entropy to maintain. So we need to get vitamins from all different sources, because entropy is subject to the law of diminishing returns. The more complex you get, the easier it is to get knocked down a peg. You can take me if you want, and you can grab me by my non-existent hair, and you could punch me in the prefrontal cortex enough times that I become dumb like an animal. You can't punch an animal in the cortex a bunch of times and make it smart like a human. We can only go down in relation to all the other species around us. And it actually takes a tremendous amount of work for us to be able to be healthy physically. We need a lot of food, we need exercise, we need the right amount of sleep, we need the right amount of water, or we're not as competitive with the rest of our species. Now, here's where we start getting into the realm of spiritual malady, is like, do you guys, and I'll ask you this question, do you guys think that these laws of entropy, do you guys think that this law of entropy also can apply to the human psychology? So, what if I'm not putting myself out there? What if I'm not expanding my horizons? What if I'm not, breaking through my comfort zone? What if I'm not challenging myself? What happens then? Essentially what happens is I turn myself psychologically into a closed system, and entropy starts to descend on me, and the world starts to descend on me, and my world starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And back in the day when I was in life, when I was a part of this thing, I was doing things that made me uncomfortable. I was learning new skills. I was playing new sports. I was excited to push myself beyond the bounds of what I've been able to be capable of in the past. And I loved it. And when you guys do that, when you do expand your comfort zone, even in micro doses, it's absolutely amazing to us. And that's what defying entropy psychologically will make us feel like. We love it. We live for it. And without it, we degenerate into nothing. So if I'm just sitting in my house doing absolutely nothing all day, every day, or I'm only partying, or I'm only doing things if I have enough heroin to sustain that activity, it's like I'm turning myself into a closed system. And what happens is the mechanism that makes me close myself off is fear. Fear effectively turns me into a closed system, and entropy begins to have its way with me, and then I'm not living life in the way a functional human being is supposed to live life. We need to do a lot of things, like we have to deal with ICBC, we have to deal with our employers, we have relationships with our significant others that's very, very complicated. We have to eat right, we have to maintain the level of complexity and even go against it on so many different fronts that a little mistake here will send us spiraling back down. Now, I know that paints a little bit of a grim picture, but here's the thing. Human beings, as the lowest entropy structures that we currently know about, we are going to have the hardest time out of anything making incremental gains in complexity. And, you know, if you're not moving forwards, you're moving backwards. And this is how appallingly true for the addict and the alcoholic. But here's the good part, is because we're so complex, we are absolutely the best at defying entropy. Not only do we have to do it more than any other species, we are better than any other species at it. We got planes, we got cars, we got computers, we got cameras and lights. Watching videos about how to recover from addiction on YouTube, like, we are so good at it. So each and every one of you guys has the power to defy entropy. What do I think spiritual malady is? Well, if you want to look through it in the lens of the eyes of a physicist, it's like we're losing the struggle against entropy. Fear has turned us into a closed system, and now life is beginning to dominate us instead of the other way around. That's it for today. That was a little bit of a long-winded explanation, but for all of you spiritual malady kind of researchers and connoisseurs out there, it's a really neat theory. I'm gonna probably have more, to be honest with you guys. I could talk endlessly about the subject. I'm also going to be releasing a video fairly soon about the step 13. Ooh, mainly it's just going to be about relationships and recovery. So you know, hopefully you guys are looking forward to that. Thank you for stopping by. Please subscribe to my channel. Please hit the like button. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.